Here we go. Now, we're getting ready to...
So, what I want to do is to lead you through the issues that the Reform movement has been dealing with for a long time, and how it has dealt with those, the development of how it has dealt with these various issues over the course of the decades, centuries, really. We've learned from the history that the Reform movement developed in the early 1800s in Germany, that it was dealing with the issue of assimilation, that in some ways it was trying to become part of the communities in which they were living, but they had to deal with all the issues that created, and that they were attempting to become a religion that was acceptable to the societies in which they were living, and that especially became true when they came to the United States, and Isaac Mayer White declared this our Jerusalem, and this is our last stand, and this is where we're going to finally escape the ravages of persecution and anti-Semitism. And so they were dealing with, could you just do me a favor, that last chair, I think, is now, yeah, thank you. That they are, fine, this is our last stand. So I want to go through, and furthermore, the issue of the development of biblical scholarship, and I use the term Wissenschaft der Judentum, which is the critical analysis, the critical study of biblical texts, and the change from viewing the biblical text as coming from God at Sinai to having been written by human beings was an enormous factor in the development of Reformed philosophy and theology. I want to just run you through quickly some people and some names, starting in Europe, to show you that there is a development to all this. There was a man named Ignaz Einhorn who lived in Germany in the 19th century, and dealing with the issue now of where authority comes from, which is going to be a critical issue that we're going to deal with. Where is authority in the Reform movement? Dealing with the issue of where authority, once you lose the authority of God giving the Torah at Sinai, and therefore the authority of the law and the rabbinate that's interpreting that law, once you lose that authority, where does the authority come from? So here in the 19th century, some man named Ignaz Einhorn tries to redefine authority as the religious consciousness of the people, as though somehow you get a collective kind of agreement as to what should or should not be done, and somehow the people recognize this as coming from God, moral dictatorship coming from God, and that ultimately, more or less, became the position of conservative Judaism, which to me represents lots of problems, but that more or less became the position of conservative Judaism. In a congregation in Pest in Germany, they developed different rituals. Got rid of the kippah, the skull cap. You introduced the organ, music in the synagogue. The prayers were in German instead of only in Hebrew. They began to accept mixed marriages, which was an enormous change. David Einhorn, who went to Baltimore, I think I mentioned David Einhorn, who went to Baltimore, who was an anti-slavery rabbi who came to KI after he left Baltimore and then went to New York, more or less accepted this kind of position and brought it here to the United States and to Baltimore. That you recognize all that from this congregation, the organ, the no hat, and all that. But those were considered tremendous changes. And by the way, the wearing of the kippah, wearing of a hat, kippah, really doesn't come out of Jewish law. There's really no legal basis, Jewish legal basis, for covering your head during prayer. That came as a later tradition. There are a lot of different understandings, interpretations, historically, as why, where that came from. But really, it did not come out of the wearing of the talit is much more found in Jewish law than is the wearing of the kippah. Nevertheless, it became obviously a very strong tradition. Julius Wellhausen, who had a real strain of anti-Semitism, but nevertheless is the name that's associated most often with the development of the critical understanding of biblical literature. The Graf Wellhausen hypothesis, as it says here, the gospel was a successful protest against Pharisaic Judaism, which is why he was considered to be anti-Semitic, because he was Christian and he's protesting Pharisaic Judaism, which had a very literal understanding of the text. But nevertheless, the Graf Wellhausen hypothesis is studied in liberal rabbinic schools all over the place, because it became essentially the basis of the notion that the biblical text is human documents and not God-given documents. And if any of you have ever studied J, E, P, and D, you know those letters. J for Yahweh, Adonai, E for Elohim, P for priestly, and D for Deuteronomy. The so-called four groups of authors of the biblical text. That has been greatly expanded and changed over the years, but that became the basis for the study of the biblical text. Hermann Cohn developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, developed the notion of ethical monotheism, which also came to be something very critical in the Reform movement. Everybody know what that means? Ethical monotheism? That comes,
our ethical code comes from God.
Some understanding,
Right.
however you get
So
that, right.
rather than being ethical culture, we're actually tied into it.
Right. That ethical, that God demands ethical behavior, and that God would never demand anything except ethical behavior. And that notion essentially comes out of prophetic Judaism, more so somewhat out of the Torah, but mostly out of prophetic Judaism. And the early reformers always referred to themselves as the inheritors of prophetic Judaism, meaning that they are the inheritors of what was called ethical monotheism, that their God was demanding ethical behavior. And which is why, by the way, it's often said that Jewish tradition is much more concerned with justice than it is with love. Love is associated with Christianity, whereas justice is much more associated with Jewish tradition. And you don't have to love your neighbor, but you have to treat your neighbor justly, is the biblical comment. So the notion of ethical monotheism became a basis for the Reform movement, and therefore its emphasis on social justice. And thus the Reform movement was able to give up the traditional ritual, keep on, bring in the organ, and give up kashrut and all the traditional rituals, and re-emphasize the notion of social justice. And therefore the Reform movement became the movement that was based on social justice and ethical behavior, much more so than on ritual. It replaced ritual. The Orthodox continued to emphasize ritual and following the law, whereas the Reform movement changed that emphasis. All right, and again, that's a break from orthodoxy. That to be a committed Reform Jew, you're committed to social justice. All right, and that was a break. And again, influenced by Kant, and some of these philosophers, do as I do. My behavior should be able to be universalized. However I function, whatever I do should be able to be universalized, and that type of philosophy. So that became ethical monotheism. Leo Beck, who was a great leader in the late 19th, early 20th, particularly in the 20th century, came to emphasize, again, ethical monotheism, but talked about a transcendent God versus an immanent God. I'm going to explain that. But before I do, Leo Beck, you may remember, was this great rabbinic leader in Germany who was sent to the concentration camps. And he refused. He was offered escape. Prior to the war, there were many places that had offered to rescue him, bring him to the United States to rescue him. And he refused to go because he said that he wanted to remain with his community. He ended up at a concentration camp, and in the concentration camps, he became a leader of the Jewish community in the concentration. He survived, and ultimately, the Leo Beck Institute in Israel is named after him. Became one of the great heroes of World War II era. He emphasized monotheism, but the transcendent God, which is interesting. The transcendent God is the notion of God, that God is separate from the world and not necessarily within the world. And the transcendent God raises issues as to whether or not God is responsive to human needs and human prayer. Now that notion, Leo Beck, who lived through the Holocaust, and others who lived through the Holocaust, began to raise questions, obviously, about God's response to human suffering. And does a purely transcendent God respond to human suffering versus a God that is immanent and involved in human behavior, which is borderline. You know what the difference between deism and theism? Deism versus theism. You know the difference? Deism is the notion of, most often described as the watchmaker. That God, deism says that God created the world, created human life, etc., and then stepped back from it and left it alone. He created the mechanism, and then said, "Here it is, it's yours. I'm not going to interfere. You will do with it what you will do. I've created the mechanism. It's going to function as best as you treat it, and I am not interfering." So, the question in a deistic theology, God is not responsive to prayer. God has stepped back. God's the watchmaker. Created it, stepped back. And therefore, Leo Beck's transcendent God notion is borderline deistic. That is, whether or not you can really pray to that kind of a God, because that God is not responsive. The theistic notion of God is a God that is involved, is immanent, and is responsive to human prayer, human suffering, etc., as involved. The transcendent God notion, they both notions raise the issue of whether or not we really are free in terms of our decision-making process, which is going to come up later on. But in a transcendent God, deistic system, is there built into the system predetermination, predestination? That is, everything that you're going to do is already known at the moment of creation. Theism obviously raises that question because you're dealing with an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, you know those terms? Mm-hmm. All-knowing, all powerful, all-present God. And that kind of God, how do you escape the notion of not, a free, where do you get free will? If God knows everything, does everything, is everywhere, how do you escape, how do you get away from the notion of free will? And that raises real serious questions of free will. So both of them do, yeah.
What's the opposite of a transcendent God?
Immanent.
And could you define those two, please?
Yeah, the transcendent God is not involved in human life. Transcendent God is somewhere, but not here, not involved in human life. But the immanent God is here, everywhere, within me, within this computer, everywhere, in nature, in human life, everywhere, is part of it. Whereas the transcendent God is not. The transcendent God exists, there's existence somewhere, but not within nature. Yeah.
Is there any difference between, we were just talking about yesterday, Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover in deism?
Between Aristotle's God and what?
unmoved mover and deism? Are they, is there any difference?
Okay, yeah. Yesterday I mentioned an Aristotelian notion of the unmoved mover. In Aristotle's notion, the only way that you can have perfection implies, if you say God is perfect, perfection in God, it implies in Aristotelian philosophy that the only thing that God can do is think about himself. Because anything else implies imperfection. I use the example, this cup is here. If I move this cup from here to here, it means this cup was not there in the first place. Therefore, that God, if that God is able to move, that means that God was not omnipresent, was not everywhere. If God is everywhere, God can't move. Right? God can't move. Therefore, God can't do anything. All right? And therefore, in Aristotelian philosophy, perfection implies that the only thing that God can do is think about himself. That's called the unmoved mover. And that built into the system is that all things aspire toward perfection. They all attempt to realize their potential. That's the movement of all things, the realization of your potential. And the classic example that's always used is the acorn strives to become the oak tree, because the potential of the acorn is to be the oak tree. The potential, all right, and that often is interfered with. If you pick up an acorn and eat it, or whatever you do, then you're interfering with the potential of that acorn. If you murder somebody, you're interfering with the potential of that human life. All human life has some potential. You may not know what it is, but it has some potential. All life has, every living thing has some potential. And that's Aristotelian. And the way that it functions is that it's almost like magnetism. Everything strives to fulfill its potential. Now, is that different from deism? Aristotelian is deistic, but more so, because in the deistic philosophy, it isn't. They don't. That's an interesting question. The deists typically aren't dealing with the issue of perfection. They're normally just simply dealing with the issue that God is separated. God is separate from the universe. Aristotelian philosophy is deistic. It is deism. It's a form of deism. Absolutely. No. It's a kind of deism. That God created it and then just left it alone, and all things strive toward perfection. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, now, other issues, again, that they were dealing with. Issue of Zionism. The early reformers opposed any form of Zionism, especially political Zionism. They may have not opposed other forms of Zionism, such as Ahad Ha'am's cultural Zionism, where Israel would be a cultural center, America would a spiritual center. He called it Amerikaz Ruchani, a spiritual center of Jewish life, but not a political entity. They may not oppose that, but they certainly opposed political Zionism, because political Zionism for them created all kinds of issues, dual loyalties, and thus anti-Semitism, and all kinds of issues. And political Zionism was opposed by classical Reform Judaism. This congregation at one time, opposed, was the center of the opposition to political Zionism. We're going to go through some of these platforms. The American Council of Judaism, which was actually centered in this congregation, was the organization that in the Reform movement that formally opposed political Zionism. It virtually I think there may be some remnant of the American Council of Judaism somewhere in this country, but it virtually disappeared once Israel came into being. Reform in this country was able to develop because it was free of political government restrictions. You remember I stated that in Europe, often these liberal congregations were shut down by the government because the Orthodox objected to them. And the Orthodox had the official imprimatur of the government, of the state in which they were living, and they could pressure the state to shut down liberal Reform congregations. So in Europe, often the Reform congregations were shut down because of pressure from the Orthodox. Sounds familiar in Israel. But that is, obviously that's not true in the United States. So therefore the Reform movement was able to flourish here, whereas in Europe it was not, because of pressure from the Orthodox but from the state through Orthodox Judaism. A mixed marriage became acceptable. We're going to discuss the mixed marriage and the Reform movement and the rabbinate of the mixed marriage. But more or less became acceptable fairly early on, just out of necessity. People, when you go to college and you associate with the non-Jewish world, this is what happens. Assimilation means ultimately mixed marriage. That's simply the fact. And that had to become more or less acceptable. Now, what I want to do, there is a whole thing here of the tenets of Reform Judaism, which I'm going to get to eventually, but I want to go through platforms which I have given you in a packet, which some of you hope will read. The first one to look at in this packet is the Columbus platform, which is really the most important of the beginning platforms. Now, I just want to share some of it. The Philadelphia and the Pittsburgh, the early Philadelphia and Pittsburgh conferences essentially were conferences which were attempting to bring together the congregations that were then considered liberal. However, in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, the leading proponents of bringing these together was Isaac Mayer Wise. That all fell apart because of one of the Trafa banquet, which I mentioned, where after the ordination ceremony, they had shrimp and lobster and all those things. And those people who were representing more traditional Judaism broke away. They rejected that. So that was the beginning of the end of the unity that Isaac Mayer Wise was seeking. And those were the Philadelphia and the Pittsburgh conferences, were essentially conferences trying to bring together this unity, and that really fell apart. So the first one I want to look at is the Columbus platform, which is in this packet that you got a long time ago, if you don't have it now.
Page 13, maybe?
Page something.
Mine says page 1.
Mine says page 1, yes.
Oh, that's what happened.
It's in here. And let me read from it. The nature of Judaism. Judaism is the historical religious experience of the Jewish people. Though growing out of Jewish life, its message is universal, aiming at the union and perfection of mankind under the sovereignty of God. Reform Judaism recognizes the principle of progressive development in religious and consciously applies this principle to spiritual as well as cultural and social life. Judaism welcomes all truth, whether written in the pages of Scripture or deciphered from the records of nature. Now, truth is in the eyes of the beholder, all truth. The new discoveries of science, while replacing the older scientific views underlying this art sacred, do not conflict with the essential spirit of religion as manifested in the consecration of man's will, heart, and mind to the service of God and humanity. Now, this is clearly a religious document, okay? Theistic, God-centered, all right? Not civilization-centered, people-centered, God-centered, all right? God. Next point, God. The heart of Judaism and its chief contribution to religion is the doctrine of the one living God who rules the world through law and love. In Him, all existence has its creative source and mankind its ideal of conduct. Though transcending time and space, He is the indwelling presence of the world. So this God is both transcendent and immanent. Both. We worship Him as the Lord of the universe and as our merciful Father. It almost sounds Christian. Doesn't it?
Yes.
Very, very theistic, God-centered. All right? Clearly religious, a religion, God-centered. Man. Judaism affirms that man is created in the divine image. His spirit is immortal. He is an active co-worker with God. As a child of God, he is endowed with moral freedom and is with the responsibility of overcoming evil and striving after it. Torah. God reveals himself not only in the majesty, beauty, and orderliness of nature, but also in the vision and moral striving of his spirit. Revelation. Listen to this one. Now remember, orthodoxy, revelation, Torah meets Sinai, took place at Sinai, Moses, to the people. Okay? Revelation is a continuous process, confined to no one group and to no one age. Yet the people of Israel, through its prophets and sages, achieved unique insight in the realm of religious truth. The Torah, both written and oral, meaning the Torah and the Talmud, okay? Both written and oral, enshrines Israel's ever-growing consciousness of God and of the moral law. It preserves the historical precedents, sanctions, and norms of Jewish life, and seeks to mold it in the pattern of goodness and... now I'm going to skip. But as a depository of permanent spiritual ideals, the Torah remains the dynamic source of life of Israel. Each age has the obligation to adapt the teachings of the Torah to its basic needs in consonance with the genius of Judaism. All right? Now, that language is philosophically chaotic. All right? We're going to examine that language later on. But it is philosophically chaotic. But they were trying to get across go ahead.
I was going to ask, chaotic or orthodox? I mean, it sounds very orthodox.
Well, it's an attempt. That's why it's chaotic. It's an attempt to break away from orthodoxy. It's an attempt to say that we are the ones who are, interpreting this, but nevertheless, it's still God-centered, Torah-centered. Yeah.
Revelation, I mean, the whole...
Yeah, in some way. Through whom? You, me, prophets? That's right. Continuous revelation. To whom? Right. Yeah.
It feels like the roots, though, of progressive interpretation, which really sets Reform Judaism apart from this charge of more relativism that we hear from, that we still hear from the Orthodox, that we're progressively interpreting and using these modern...
Right. There's no question about that.
But here's the root.
Right. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. But it's clearly a breakaway from orthodoxy. But where it's going it becomes problematic. Israel. Judaism is the soul, of which Israel is the body, living in all parts of the world. Israel has been held together by ties of common history, etc., etc., etc. And it goes on and talks about Palestine, rebuilding, the end. Throughout the ages, it has been Israel's mission to witness to the divine in the face of every form of paganism and materialism. We regard it as our historic task to cooperate with all men in establishing the kingdom of God, of universal brotherhood, justice, truth, and peace. This is our messianic goal. Israel, therefore, becomes almost synonymous with Jewish people and not with a political entity. All right? Israel becomes the people, the mission of the people of Israel, and not with a political entity. Clearly separating it. Ethics and religion, Judaism, religion, and morality blended in inside of unity, social justice, peace, all the emphasis on all these things, justice, peace. Now, religious practice. Jewish life is marked by consecration to these ideals of Judaism. It calls for faithful participation in the life of Jewish communities. It finds expression in home, synagogue, and school. The home has been and must continue to be the stronghold. The synagogue is the oldest and most democratic institution of Jewish life. It is the prime communal agency by which Judaism is fostered and preserved. It links the Jews of each community and unites them with all Israel, on and on and on. Prayer is the voice of religion, the language of faith and aspiration. It directs man's heart and mind Godward, prayer. Judaism is a way of life requires, in addition to its moral and spiritual demands, the preservation of. It doesn't say the observance of. The preservation of the Sabbath, festivals, and holy days. The retention and development of such customs doesn't say observance. The language here is intentional. The retention and development of such symbols, customs, symbols, and ceremonies as possess inspirational values. Who's going to decide which customs and ceremonies retain inspirational values? The cultivation of distinctive forms of religious art and music and the use of Hebrew, together with the vernacular in our worship and instructions. So, a retention of these symbols, holidays, whatever, which provide inspiration. Who decides that? Yeah,
You said preservation of, but not observing some.
that's what it
But
says
if
here.
you don't
yes.
observe, how you preserve it?
Well, you can, because if you are saying that we are preserving the Sabbath rather than observing the Sabbath, you can go to synagogue on Friday night and go to work on Saturday. Now you're preserving the Sabbath in the sense that you're recognizing its existence, but you're not observing it in any traditional way.
Not observing it to the letter of the parameters.
Right, yeah, that's right. So that the Orthodox would argue you're not observing the Sabbath.
They still do.
You're preserving it by having a synagogue service. But that's not in the command. That's not a command. Having a synagogue service is not a commandment. You can pray at home. There's no commandment to have a synagogue service.
Then fully observe it.
Well, observe. By going to synagogue, Orthodox, this is attempted to distinguish itself from language of Orthodoxy. Orthodox would say going to a synagogue service is not observing the Sabbath. It's recognizing its existence, but you're observing it by not writing, by not working, by not doing all those things that are causing observance. Versus preserving it by going to synagogue service,
Doing everything.
or by lighting the Shabbat candles after dark,
It reminds me of the Constitution.
which a lot of people do.
Yeah, right.
It's,
It reminds me of the Constitution. It's written in a language that is, whether you're a tight constructionist or a loose constructionist. And Reform movement is the loose constructionist of the language.
Right, that's right. But it's clear. It's a clear attempt to break away the language of Orthodoxy.
It's in some ways it's even more radical than that, because Orthodox, you shall observe the Sabbath.
Right.
And that's a law.
Right.
This is saying, well, maybe it's not a law, it's a suggestion.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so that's a radical
Right.
shift.
It was radical.
Tradition.
And this was intentional. This language is intentional. They knew that. These people knew what they were writing. Absolutely.
They should have fixed the Constitution.
Maybe good lawyers.
All right, the last paragraph there. These timeless aims and ideals of our faith we present anew to a confused and troubled world. They should see the world now.
This is 1885.
No, it's
This
37.
is the Columbus Papal, 1937. 1937. They should watch these debates once you confuse them. All right. We call upon our fellow Jews to dedicate themselves to them and in harmony with all men, hopefully and courageously to continue Israel's eternal quest after God and His kingdom. All right, so that's one of the early conferences. I want to skip Breslau for the moment because Breslau is even. I want to go to. Can't get through, unfortunately, all of this there with the Philadelphia. The Philadelphia conference is listed here. It's again one of the earlier ones. And here is the Pittsburgh platform. All right. Now, Pittsburgh platform. This is much later. Before I go to Pittsburgh, I want to go to Miami, 1997. You want to go to Miami? That's 1997. Now remember, we just read a platform which was anti-Zionist. Okay. This is 1997. In recognition of the centenary of the First World Zionist Congress, the Central Conference of American Rabbis hereby issues its first platform dedicated dedicated exclusively to the relationship between Reform Judaism and Zionism. In 1885, the framers of the Pittsburgh platform declared that they no longer expect the Jews to return to a national homeland in Palestine. The platform's authors proclaimed, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation," this is out of the Pittsburgh platform of 1885, "but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state."
This is the early Pittsburgh?
That's a reference to
Oh, reference.
the 1885 Pittsburgh platform. By 1937, the CCR had reversed its stand on the Jewish peoplehood and declared in its Columbus plan, Judaism is the soul of which Israel, the people, is the body. The document further states, "We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid the building up of Palestine as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make not only a haven of refuge of the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life." So by the Columbus platform, they're talking about cultural Zionism, but not political Zionism. All right, so there's a step forward. This affirmation of Jewish peoplehood was accomplished by a reaffirmation of Reformed Judaism's universal message. We regard it as our historic task to cooperate with all men in the establishment of the kingdom of God, of universal brotherhood, justice, truth. That was our messianic goal. That's right out of the Columbus platform. Now, the CCR returned again to the question of Zionism in 1976, asserting in its centenary perception, "We are bound to the newly reborn state of Israel by innumerable religious and ethnic ties. We have both a stake and a responsibility in building the state of Israel, assuring its security," etc., etc. Bottom paragraph. A century after Theodore Herzl called for the creation of a modern Jewish state, and nearly 50 years since the state of Israel joined the family of modern nations, the fundamental issue addressed in the previous CCR pronouncement continued to challenge us, making this a fitting time to re-examine and redefine the ideological. Let's find the back of this. Ideological, spiritual bonds that connect Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. Now it becomes the state, okay? The CCR affirms through its platform those principles which God reformed Judaism in the 21st century. And then it goes on. Judaism as a religion of the people reaffirms that. Number 3, even as Medina Israel serves uniquely as the spiritual and cultural focal of the world Jewry, Israel and diaspora Jewry are interdependent, responsible for one another, and partners in the shaping of the Jewish destiny. Each Jewish community, though autonomous and self-regulated, shares responsibility for the fate of Jews everywhere. By deepening the social, spiritual, and intellectual relationship between the Kehilot, the communities worldwide, we can revitalize Judaism both in Israel and diaspora. To help promote the security of Medina and ensure the welfare of its citizens, we pledge continued political support and financial assistance. Recognizing the knowledge of Hebrew, etc., to enhance appreciation of Jewish peoplehood, on and on and on. And then the last paragraph of that, confident that Reformed Judaism's synthesis of tradition and modernity, its historic commitment to Tikkun Olam, can make a unique and positive contribution to the state, we resolve to intensify our efforts to inform and educate Israelis about the values of Reformed Judaism. We call upon Reformed Jews everywhere to dedicate their energies and resources to the strengthening of an indigenous progressive Judaism in the Medina Israel. So far, what is not here? Yes.
It's Zionism.
No, Aliyah. Encouraging Aliyah, encouraging people to go to Israel. That's not here. That's clear. That's significant. Okay. Now, Israel's obligation to the diaspora. Medina exists not only for the benefit of the citizens, but also to defend the physical security and spiritual integrity of the Jewish people. Realizing that Am Yisrael consists of a coalition of different, sometimes conflicting religious interpretations, the Jewish people will best serve when Medina is constituted as a pluralistic, democratic society. Therefore, we seek a Jewish state in which no religious interpretation of Judaism takes legal precedence over another. All right? Has not happened. Not happening. We believe that renewal and perpetuating Jewish national life in Eretz Yisrael is a necessary condition to the realization of the physical and spiritual redemption of Jewish people, etc., etc. Last paragraph, we stand firm in our love of Zion. We resolve to work for the day when waves of Jewish pride and rich confidence will infuse every Jewish heart and fulfillment, etc., etc. Our mouths will fill with the laughter and tongues and on and on. So the point of that is that now there is a serious connection to Israel, but it's not encouraging Aliyah. It is not encouraging movement to Israel. but a serious connection. And of course, as you know, Hebrew College has a campus in Jerusalem, and all students during the course of their time at rabbinic school or cantorial school are required to spend a year in Israel. But you read the news, and there's the constant tension between the liberal elements of Reform Judaism and what happens in Israel at the wall, and the constant tension that goes on, and that the Orthodox still control religious life in Israel, still control, and that creates issues. Yeah.
Was this written at a time to sort of oppose the increasing domination of the Orthodox in Israel life? And they're really focusing on supporting a progressive movement in Israel. Was this for the first time? Was this adopted because they saw an encroaching increase in the influence of Orthodoxy in Israel?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that it is both, and I think it is that. No question, it is that, and it is also a result of greater identification with the Reform movement of some Israelis, so that there are rabbis who are ordained in Israel. And so there are some, the Reform movement in Israel is still very small, these all those Israeli Jews, but there's some pressure now from them to make some positive statement about, so it's both.
Right.
Yes, both. And it would be interesting to see what would be written today. They sort of stayed away from it. But what would be written today, because of all of the issues that are taking place with all kinds of things. So it'd be very interesting, yeah.
Although Rabbi Rick Jacobs certainly has been vocal in speaking out against the
Palestinian stuff, yeah. Very much so.
And also on behalf of development of progressive Jews in Israel.
Jewish conferences, there were extreme positions on either side, I would assume, but maybe not. What were some of these opposing discussions in the contemporary meetings?
Well, you have within the Reform, contentious in Jewish life. You certainly have within the Reform movement a broad spectrum. You have within the Reform movement that part of the movement which is very critical of Israel's policies, very critical of their treatment of the Arabs in Israel, very critical of their clear movement toward a single state solution. There's not even discussion anymore about the double so-called two-state solution. Their movement toward a single state, very critical of that. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who consistently refer to Arab hostility and the fact that the Arab countries do not recognize Israel's existence, and the fact that their Hamas and Hezbollah and on are totally committed to the destruction of Israel, and that remains their primary goal, and how else is Israel going to respond except to build walls and gather the best possible military and not have a two-state. So you have both. Sure, you have both extremes, both elements, and unfortunately, fortunately, there's truth in both. There's truth in both. And if you are living in Israel today, if you are not an Orthodox, just a secular Israeli living in Israel today, you are caught in the middle of both truths. They are both true. That maybe treatment of the Arabs would have made things different, maybe, but there is scant evidence that the attitude of Hamas and Hezbollah and those groups that Israel should not continue to exist would ever change. I mean, they're both true, and therefore, how do you deal with that? And sure, and there are those both elements, within the Reform movement, and There are Reformed Jews who go to AIPAC, and there are Reformed Jews who go to J Street. And they think that each others are, almost heretical positions. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay. Last one, this Pittsburgh conference in 1999, then I'm going to move on. We affirm the reality and oneness of God. I'm just reading from parts of it. Even as we differ in our understanding of the divine presence. We affirm the Jewish people is bound to God by an eternal covenant as reflected in our varied understanding of creation, revelation, and redemption. We affirm that every human being is created but still only in the image of God, and that we therefore, every human life is sacred. We regard reverence of all God creation. We recognize our human responsibility for its preservation and protection. I want to go on to Torah. We affirm that Torah is the foundation of Jewish life. We cherish the truths revealed in Torah, God's ongoing revelation to our people, and the record of our people's ongoing relationship with God. I frankly don't even know what that means. We cherish the truths revealed in Torah. I'll read it again. God's ongoing revelation to our people, and the record of our people's ongoing relationship with God. We affirm that Torah is a manifestation of God's eternal love for the Jewish people and for all humanity. We affirm the importance of studying Hebrew in the language of Torah. We are called by Torah to lifelong study in the home, synagogue, etc., etc. We are committed to the ongoing study of the whole array of mitzvot and to the fulfillment of those that address us as individuals and the communities that we bring Torah into the world when we seek to sanctify the names and places of our lives through regular home and congregation observance. Shabbat calls us to bring the highest moral values to our daily labor, to culminate the work week with Kedushah, with some sense of the sacred, of holiness, rest, joy. The high holy days call us to account for our deeds. The festivals enable us to celebrate, etc., etc. This is the difference between observance and recognition. We bring Torah into the world when we strive to fulfill the highest ethical mandates in our relationship with others and with all God's creation. You can see how these platforms are written by the diverse elements. Clearly, they're written by committees that represent the diverse elements within the movement. Yeah.
As I said, this 1999 came out of the work from Rabbi Richard Levy, and I don't know if people remember, there was a Reformed Judaism magazine, famous one, the picture of him wearing talents.
Right.
And so I was actually on a regional board of UAHC at the time, and we took his proposed platform, and each one of these, that's why it sounds so familiar, we broke up into small groups and we discussed and parsed each of these statements that he made, brought it back to our congregations, and the next month brought it back. And I guess that's the end result is, like you said, what does this mean? Because, we've debated and discussed it, how is it all worded?
Right.
So it's interesting to see how the process works.
Right. I was in school with Dick Levy. Dick Levy went to California to the LA school and became a voice of the more traditional elements of the movement. A very, very bright voice of that element, but a voice nevertheless of that element. Gene Borowitz, who was a professor of philosophy at Hebrew College in New York, who just died, became a voice for decades of a sort of the covenantal relationship with God was Borowitz's shtick. That somehow we had a covenant with God. Somehow you observe that and you know God. And once again, we're going to talk about all that. But once again, after you read it and you hear it and you stop and you say to yourself, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean to say I have a covenantal relationship with God? It's nice to say it. What does it mean? And what is this? What does all this mean? So, what does it mean? Ongoing revelation. What does it mean that Torah contains the truths that we know? What does all that mean? So, let me just continue because we're never going to get through all this today. I want to just go on while I'm raising these issues, and I'm showing you that again that Reform movement remained, even though it adopted some of the elements of relationship with Israel and the peoplehood. The people of Israel now have some kind of a covenantal responsibility to ethics and morality and social justice and all of those things, it still remained a God-centered religious system. All right? Still, and may still remain that today. We're going to analyze that. A God-centered religious system. Mordecai Kaplan. Mordecai Kaplan lived in the 20th century. He became the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. Judy Kaplan, by the way, this is listed there, was the first bat mitzvah. His daughter was the first bat mitzvah. Mordecai Kaplan developed the notion of Judaism and civilization, which became a critically important position in American Jewish life. Mordecai Kaplan taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, but he was not a conservative Jew. Mordecai Kaplan developed the notion that Israel is, that Jewish life is not God-centered, it is civilization-centered. Because it contains all of the elements of civilization. It contains a language, Hebrew. It contains a land, Israel. It contains a culture. It contains a history. It contains a people. It contains art and literature. And it contains a concept of God. Kaplan was not a theist. Kaplan was a naturalist. He believed that God was in nature. That he was almost a Spinoza-type naturalist. God was synonymous with nature. And even though his prayer book is fairly, the Reconstructionist prayer book has all the traditional elements, Kaplan, I don't know how, I never met Kaplan, but I don't know how he would have prayed, because God is synonymous with nature, and I don't know how nature responds to prayer. But nevertheless, his influence that it is civilization-centered and not God-centered became a major influence in the Reform movement, perhaps more so than the conservative movement. Because now people in the Reform movement are now able to relate to a definition of Jewish life which gives them greater latitude. Yeah.
I'll just mention briefly, I used to belong to a Reconstructionist synagogue. From a religious practice standpoint, I mean, it's very interesting. You look at an observance, an obligation, and we would discuss, does this still make sense today for our community? And if it did, we would continue it. If it didn't, we would reconstruct it. We wouldn't get rid of it. We would come up with another way of observing or recognize that tradition. Because tradition, the term was, as a vote, but not a veto.
Right.
As
As a vote, but not a veto.
Which really came out of the conservative movement. That, where was this Reconstruction occurring?
Up in Bucks County.
Okay. One of the major, I think one of the most wonderful Reconstructionist congregations in this country is in Indianapolis. Sandy Eisenberg Sasso and her husband Dennis Sasso were the co-rabbis of the congregation in Indianapolis. And Sandy Eisenberg Sasso grew up in Philadelphia. She was a KI. She was a college student when I knew her, taught her. And she was the second rabbi to be ordained. She was always very, very disturbed that she missed it by a year. She always disturbed that she missed it by a year. But an enormously creative person, a lot of children's books. You probably used them at the congregation. A lot of children's books from Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. But a tremendous influence within the Reform movement, because it gave greater latitude to our understanding of what Jewish life is. So that now adds an element. Now the last piece to this is the issue of biblical criticism of that piece. Well, no, there are other pieces. The biblical criticism, which I said gave us a whole different approach to biblical studies. So we study Bible and Talmud and all the literature in the context of when they were written, and we give it. Therefore, we study it within their historical context. So when we're studying the flood story, we're talking about where it comes from in ancient Babylonia. We're not just discussing it as some God-driven event. Where does the story come from? Where does the creation story come from in other ancient Near Eastern literature? And what did it mean to the people of Israel then? And what did it mean to the people of Israel and how was it interpreted over the course of the centuries? And that's the way we study it, which is a whole different understanding. And that therefore, and that's the break, by the way, that's the break from orthodoxy. Once you make the decision that you're going to study the Torah and the literature critically as human documents, you have broken from orthodoxy. All right? Now, Reconstructionists accepts that. The conservative movement, I don't want to give it sort of, I don't know, but Reconstructionists accepts that. You made the break, and the two terms that are used in orthodoxy, Torah Shebiktav and Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebiktav means Torah, written Torah, which is the Torah, and Torah Shebal Peh means the oral law, meaning the Talmud. And those are both considered revealed documents by orthodoxy, and both rejected as revealed documents by the Reform movement. And that's the critical break, historically. All right? We're going to talk about theism, deism. I talked about theism, deism, naturalism, humanism. I have a whole write-up about humanism. And there's one more thing that I handed out, which I'm going to discuss, we probably won't get to until next week, which is polydoxy, which you probably never heard of, but it is a critically important understanding of what we are. So, we have this search for meaning. What is the definition of reform? And reform believes in freedom and ambiguity. Now, if I were to go around this room, and ask you each to give your definition of what you think about God, whether you believe there is one, isn't one, or if you do believe there is one, what that is, I would guess we would have 25 different positions. Some believe there is, some believe there isn't, etc. I would guess the same would be true if I asked you about your concept of afterlife, or your concept of what you should observe or should not observe, and whether it's okay, whether wearing a kippah is necessary or not necessary, or whether it's even should be not allowed. If some Reform used to not allow it. If I were to ask you each questions about what you do, what you believe, I would get all kinds of different responses. Okay? And that then becomes the discussion of what is a Reformed Jew? Who is a Reformed Jew? Which one of you is the real Reformed Jew? And that then becomes a discussion of how we define ourselves, and is there any way to define ourselves? And what then, if there's such ambiguity, and I'm sure there is, if there's such ambiguity, then how do you, what do you think is the values that you would propose that deserve our continued existence? If you are attempting to be a salesperson and go to somebody and say, I think that Reformed Judaism is really the way to go here, and that it is the one that presents the values that are going to make a difference in our world and in our lives and in the lives of our children, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would be your sales pitch? What would be your sales pitch? What would you tell, what do you tell your children and your grandchildren? I want you to marry a Jew. I want you to continue Jewish life into your future, and I want it to be Reformed Judaism. What's your sales pitch? Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that Reformed Judaism is a big tent, and that as a Reformed Jew, one looks to the particular community, whether it's a synagogue or something else, that you are comfortable with, because I think we all have different meanings, and I think that that we as Reformed Jews, I think that what's going on is probably correct, that if we do not welcome intermarriage and the stranger and everybody else, that Judaism will not survive.
But what do you say is the essence of this movement that
Well-
makes it special and worth preserving?
For me, it is the basis on ethics and morality and the and doing tikkun olam and everything else that connects us to other people and helps.
I could be an ethnoculturalist
Be a
and
citizen.
have the same, have
But
the
we
same
have nicer music.
Actually be a citizen.
Hmm?
You could be a secular citizen and still espouse those values that Adele just said in terms
But there's a cultural, I mean, there's the whole cultural thing about cultural Judaism and about our ancestors, where they came from, and the fact of the Holocaust and all of those things that contribute to our sense of ourselves as Jews, maybe not religious, quote, religious Jews, but Jews. It's where we came from.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about that. And this is the essence of this class, as to what it is that ties you to a movement that we call Reform Judaism, and what is the essence of that, if there is an essence, and what it is that you're trying to pass on to future generations that is worth preserving. And the Orthodox have a very clear answer to that. This is God's law, this is God's command. There's a very clear answer to that. We have ambiguity. We have a whole different approach to the way we study, to the way we think, to the way we treat each other. Yes, it's nice to say we're inclusive. It's nice to say we're welcoming. It's all those things. But what do I tell my grandchildren? You should retain. This is worth preserving. Whatever whatever it means by this is worth preserving. So we're going to study some more. I suspect we're never going to finish all the things I want to finish here, and maybe we can continue next week. I know next week we're on, and then the following week there's a program, Islam.
That's not until it's not until 11:30.
After your.
It's.
Oh, is it really?
I don't think there's anything scheduled for the 10:15.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, I'll see if we can schedule something in. I did not know that. I thought that's why we were not scheduled. I thought that was.
I think they deliberately put the Islam program after, so you can.
I know we were not scheduled, but nevertheless, I think we can, I'll see if we can. Because we're just never gonna get through it. Next week was on the schedule, was the last week, but the 28th would be lovely if we can continue it. So I will see if I can get that on schedule. I didn't know that, I thought it was conflicting. Yeah.
So just to end, will you give us your definition?
Next week.
What it means and why we should continue, what we should tell our grandchildren?
I will. You have to come again. I'll bring my grandchildren. Yeah.
An example of this kind of discussion is going on now in the Republican debates on who is a conservative. It's very simple.
Not like
I hope
this.
not.
Bring it out.
Really?
No.
I'll tell you a story.
Philosophy is
Can I tell a story about
philosophy
Lexi's? Yes. We have a nephew who was gay and who just got married, and he and his now husband wanted to do the ceremony themselves. They did not want an officiant. So it happened they're doing the cells thing, happened to be on a Saturday afternoon, and I wasn't going to do it on a Saturday afternoon anyway, but nevertheless, we got together on Friday, and in front of a few witnesses, I signed the ketubah and signed the license, and they got married. And then the next day, they had this ceremony, they did it themselves. And our then 10-year-old granddaughter was there, and after the service, this is two males, okay? And after the service, I said, Lexi, so tell me what you think of that service, that ceremony. She thought back and she said, well, you know, I guess I would have preferred that it would have been officiated by a rabbi. And that was her reaction. Okay? Which shows, to me, I was so stunned at first that she wanted to be officiated by a rabbi, maybe, but which shed her commitment to Jewish life, and maybe me, but that the notion that this was too was irrelevant. I mean, it wasn't even noticed. Wasn't even noticed. Which says something about the values that we're passing on, which you don't find, right? So we do pass on values, sometimes without even knowing it. But I was so stunned that she didn't even notice it. It was just, it's a marriage.
But were those necessarily Jewish values, or those?
And these were two Jewish people. Yeah.
No, I understand, but the fact that she perfectly accepted the relationship and the marriage, that wasn't necessarily Jewish values that she was expressing.
Well, she had adopted it as Jewish values because we were accepting of it. The whole family was accepting of it. She had adopted it as a Jewish value.
Right. But
She saw it as a legal wedding that should have been officiated
by a rabbi.
Right.
But that's our
Right.
experience. Well, that was very Jewish.
That's
That
what
was
she,
very-
but she saw, no, she knew that whole thing. This is, the whole family is behind, is supportive of this, and this is a Jewish thing. And it was under a chuppah, she sort of.
Why would you not have performed that on a Saturday?
Because I don't officiate at weddings during Shabbat.
Yeah, but.
Why not?
Why? I mean,
That's a good question. That's a good question. The traditional answer to that, the Orthodox answer to that, is that the Orthodox would never do that because you have to sign the ketubah.
Right.
And you can't do that on Shabbat.
But what is your?
So for me,
You as a reformed.
because I still want some recognition, again, observance, some recognition that this is a different day. And that on this day, this is a different day, and it's Shabbat. And so if you want to get married, and by the way, while I say I don't, I really do. Because I arbitrarily set a time. In the summer, it gets dark at 9 o'clock at night. I don't ask couples to wait till 9:30 at night to get married. So I have arbitrarily set a time of 6 o'clock where I will officiate. And that's arbitrary, totally arbitrary. But I'm saying to them, it's because it's Shabbat, arbitrarily setting a time, 6 o'clock. Just a recognition that this is a different day.
Right.
That's all. Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by what has been accepted by the Reform movement and what has been rejected. So you would drive to that wedding, but you wouldn't perform it. Out of the same prayer, we put mezuzahs on the doors, but we don't do the whole tefillin thing. Who decided that?
That's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
But we do lots of things that are absolutely contrary to what we believe. Every time we have the Torah, we put the Torah back, we sing Bezot HaTorah Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael. That prayer says Bezot Asher Sam Moshe, which was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's what that says.
Right.
And we don't believe it.
Right.
It would take
Throughout
up.
the prayer book, there are things
Well, you
like
can
that.
choose, post them assigned upon your door, and then
Right.
for frontlets.
Are we going to, next week, do a little God talk? About, because I think that is really. one
Read
of
this
the-
document that I handed out
Okay.
called Polydoctric Judaism. If you still have 3 or 4 minutes, I'll give you some background on this document. This document was written by Alvin Reines. Alvin Reines was a professor at Hebrew Union College for many years, a professor of philosophy in Cincinnati. Alvin Reines and I are first cousins. We are the descendants of Isaac Jacob Reines, who was the founder of Mizrahi, the Orthodox Zionist movement found in the very beginning of the 20th century. Isaac Jacob Reines is in every Jewish encyclopedia. He was a prominent rabbi in Eastern Europe. Alvin Reines, when he was young, we were first cousins. When he was young, was as orthodox as one could possibly be. He wouldn't have a glass of water in your house. He was so orthodox. He was within 6 months of Orthodox semicha, Orthodox ordination at Yeshiva College in New York. And he dropped out. Radically left Orthodoxy. Went to law school for a couple of years in New York. And then went to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and the program in Cincinnati is 5 years. He went through in 3. He then went to Harvard and studied with Professor Wolfson, who was the great Spinoza scholar, and got a PhD in 5 or 6 years from Wolfson. Wolfson was noted as keeping people for 15 years, to get a PhD. And he got his PhD in 5 or 6 years from Harry Emerson Wilson, the great Spinoza scholar at Harvard. And then went back to Hebrew Union College and taught philosophy for years. Obviously, because he was studied in yeshiva and was within a hair's breadth of Orthodox semicha, obviously knew the Orthodox texts as well as anyone. A quick story. My bar mitzvah was in an Orthodox synagogue. So I studied Orthodox. I also studied. I only studied Orthodoxy until I was 21 years old. I never studied with an Orthodox teacher. And he came to my service, and he was in his radical element at the time. He was had rejected Orthodoxy and was going through all kinds of rebellion. And walked into this Orthodox synagogue with no yarmulke and no talis. And the shamus, the shamus is chasing him down. He's, get that off of me! Get that off! I still remember he's yelling, get that off of me! And he sits down in the front pew, and the shamus is arguing with him, and the rabbi stops the service. And he and the rabbi, in Yiddish, engage in a disputation about the law, and no one knew what they were arguing about. And the two of them are arguing in Yiddish. The rabbi is screaming down from the pulpit, and he's screaming down in Yiddish. And finally, the rabbi concedes the point that he doesn't have to put on talis. Wow. They negotiated. He put out a yarmulke without a talis, and the law was right that if you're single, you do not have to wear talis. He was single. And he knew that. He was arguing Talmudic law with the rabbi, and and so they negotiated. He ended up putting on a kippah, no talis. But
I thought it was really very strange in a progressive synagogue, in the West London synagogue, when you're given a set of rules as you walk in. And one is that you have, and I was with Sid New at the time, both of us go from classic Reformed congregations, that you had to put a kippah on.
Yeah, well, congregations have the right. Well, we're going to read this, but a community has the right to create its own rules, its own rules.
And then you finish the Alvin story at AUC.
Oh, the other Alvin story, yeah. Alvin was. We were studying a book by an author named Brightman, and the author of the book was claiming that it was possible to believe in an omniscient God who was not omnipotent, that God could be all-knowing but not all-powerful. And I was arguing, and I read the book, and I argued in class. I got into an argument with him in class that was not possible, that if God was omniscient, God would know how to overcome the lack of potency. He was arguing, for example, you might see someone who's about to be hit by a car, but you can't stop it because you're not omnipotent. And I said, yes, that's true. I'm not omnipotent, but I'm also not omniscient. I don't know how to overcome that deficiency. If you're really omniscient, you do know how to overcome that deficiency. And I can stop that person. And we argued for, 10 or 15 minutes about that, and he was getting nowhere, and I was getting nowhere, and he finally said to me in his own sarcastic way, Mr. Fuchs, you suffer from familial obscurity. And I responded, and this is in front of a whole class of students, and I responded and said, that sounds serious. Do you have it also? I think I was going to flunk me, but read this, because it's the movement. You're right. Whoever said the movement is broad. It's very broad. The question is it coherent? Is there some sense of coherency to this movement? Yes, it's nice to be broad. It's nice to include everything. But when you're including everything, is there some sense of coherence? How do you hang together as a movement?
I think you almost can't unless you can find one.
Well, read this.
One principle. Yeah, I will.
And this is a question of how you hang together as a movement if you're trying to include everything. So we'll talk about that next week, and we're going to get to rituals eventually, and maybe I can extend this a week. I'll see if the calendar will allow it. I thought that they were in conflict. I thought that the programs were in conflict, but if they're not.
I thought you were
said
going to
they're
teach
not.
the Islam part. I thought you were going to teach the Islam part if I'm not coming.
No, they're pretty, it's as long as scholars.
Yeah.
Somebody from that.
We should.
Yeah.
I know a lot. I read the Quran.
No, but
All right, well, this has been fun. Did you all sign the, somewhere, it's somewhere, I don't know where it is.
Let's make sure that nobody chips in.
Thank you for taking care of us. Thank you so much.